Rain fell hard over the hills of Ashbourne on the evening Margaret Whitfield arrived at Blackmore Hall. She walked the last mile on foot, her trunk left behind at the village inn, because she could not afford a cart to carry it further. Her father, the vicar of a small parish 2 counties away, had died suddenly 3 weeks earlier, and within days she had learned that his modest estate was so deeply mortgaged that nothing remained for her at all. The vicarage was given to a new clergyman within the fortnight. Meg, as her father had always called her, found herself with 1 trunk, a small purse of coins, and nowhere to go. She had heard, through a distant cousin of her mother's, that the Duke of Ashbourne kept a large household and might have need of a governess for his young daughter. It was not much to go on, but it was something, and Meg had never been a woman to wait quietly for fortune to arrive. She knocked at the servants' entrance of Blackmore Hall with her hair plastered to her face and her boots soaked through, and asked to see the housekeeper. Mrs. Adelaide Bellamy was not an easy woman to win over. She had run the hall for over 20 years, through good times and lean ones, and she had little patience for strangers who appeared at her door uninvited. She looked Meg over from her wet hem to her steady eyes and asked her plainly what she wanted. "Work," Meg said. "Any work you have. I can teach, I can keep accounts, I can sew. I will not be a burden." Mrs. Bellamy might have turned her away, as she had turned away others before, but something in the girl's voice, calm, even after such evident hardship, made her pause. She studied Meg a moment longer, noting the straight back, the steady hands clasped before her despite the cold, and the way the girl met her eyes without flinching, even though she clearly had nothing left to bargain with. It was not the look of a beggar. It was the look of someone determined to make her own way, whatever the circumstances demanded. Against her better judgment, Mrs. Bellamy decided the matter was not hers alone to settle, and she brought Meg before the Duke himself, more out of habit than expectation, since His Grace rarely concerned himself with such matters anymore. Edmund Lockhart, Duke of Ashbourne, sat in his study surrounded by papers he was not reading. He had been a different man 2 years before, when his wife was alive, and the hall had been full of voices and light. Since her death, he had retreated into duty without purpose, managing his estate because it was expected of him, not because he found any pleasure in it. His daughter Sophie, now 6 years old, had grown quiet in a way that worried everyone, but which he did not know how to address. He looked up when Mrs. Bellamy brought the stranger in, listened to her brief and dignified request, and agreed almost without thinking. "A fortnight," he said. She could stay a fortnight, tutor Sophie if the child would allow it, and then she must find a permanent situation elsewhere. He returned to his papers before she had even left the room, and did not think of her again that day. Meg was given a small room in the east wing, plain but dry, and she set about her work the very next morning. Sophie was a serious child, fair-haired, like her late mother, who spoke only when necessary, and spent most of her hours alone in the nursery, with her dolls arranged in silent rows. Previous governesses had tried lessons, schedules, and firm instruction, all without success. Meg tried something different. She sat on the floor beside Sophie, picked up one of the dolls, and simply began to talk to it as though it were a real person with opinions and troubles of its own. Sophie watched for a long while before she finally said, in a small voice, that the doll did not like porridge. It was the first sentence she had spoken to anyone outside her father in nearly a year. From that small beginning, the two grew close with surprising speed. Meg never pushed. She let Sophie set the pace of their lessons, weaving reading and numbers into games and stories rather than lectures. She taught the child her letters by writing them in the soft earth of the garden with a stick, and taught her sums by counting out the buttons on an old coat. When Sophie grew tired or sad, Meg did not scold her into attention, but simply sat beside her in silence until the child was ready to speak again, a patience that none of the previous governesses had ever shown. Slowly, the walls Sophie had built around herself since her mother's death began to soften. She began asking Meg questions about the world beyond the hall, about the sea she had never seen, and the stars she liked to count from her window. Within a month, the nursery that had been silent for so long was filled with the sound of a child's laughter, drifting down the corridors of Blackmore Hall like something the old house had nearly forgotten how to hold. Meg did not stop at the nursery. She had grown up managing a vicarage with very little money, and she had a sharp eye for waste. Within her first weeks, she noticed that the kitchen accounts did not add up, that certain deliveries of grain and coal seemed far smaller than what was being paid for, and that the household steward, a man named Hobbs, grew uneasy whenever the ledgers were mentioned. She brought her concerns first to Mrs. Bellamy, carefully, and without accusation, and together, the two women began to quietly verify what Meg suspected. It took very little time to confirm that Hobbs had been pocketing the difference on deliveries for years, confident that no one paid close enough attention to notice. When Mrs. Bellamy brought the matter to the Duke with figures Meg had carefully prepared, Edmund was startled into genuine attention for the first time in months. He dismissed Hobbs within the week, and found himself, almost without meaning to, asking Mrs. Bellamy, who had uncovered the matter. "The new governess, Your Grace," she said, "Miss Whitfield." He had nearly forgotten her name. After that, Edmund began to notice things he had stopped noticing. The linens in the guest rooms were mended rather than simply replaced or left torn. The kitchen ran with less waste and somehow produced better meals. The garden, long neglected, had been quietly tended by one of the under-gardeners, under instructions he later learned had come from Meg, who had pointed out that a kitchen garden properly kept could save the household a considerable sum each season. Most of all, he noticed his daughter. Sophie sang to herself now while she dressed in the mornings. She asked questions at supper. She had begun, in small and tentative ways, to be a child again. He found reasons to seek Meg out. At first they were practical reasons, a question about Sophie's progress, a comment on the household accounts, a request for her opinion on whether the East Wing ought to be opened for the coming winter. But the conversations rarely ended where they began. Meg spoke to him plainly, without the careful flattery he was used to from those around him who remembered always that he was a duke before he was a man. She disagreed with him when she thought he was wrong, teased him gently when he was overly serious, and asked after his own well-being with a directness that no one else in his household dared attempt. She asked him once, quite simply, whether he had eaten anything that day besides coffee, and laughed when he could not answer her. Edmund found, to his own quiet surprise, that he looked forward to these conversations more than to anything else in his day, and that the hours when she was occupied elsewhere in the house felt strangely long by comparison. In the evenings, when Sophie had been put to bed, he sometimes found Meg in the small library, reading by candlelight, and rather than retreating to his study, as had become his habit, he would take the chair across from her and simply remain in her company, often saying very little at all. There was a comfort in her presence that required no performance, no careful maintenance of his title or his grief. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt less like a duke managing an estate, and more like a man simply living in his own home. The fortnight came and went without either of them mentioning it. A month passed, then two. Meg made no further effort to seek a position elsewhere, and Edmund made no effort to remind her that she ought to. Mrs. Bellamy watched the pair of them with the knowing patience of someone who had seen a great deal of life, and recognized exactly what was forming between them, long before either Edmund or Meg would have admitted it themselves. It was into this quiet, settling happiness that Lord Percival Ashe arrived, unannounced, on a gray afternoon in late autumn. Percival was Edmund's cousin, and, since Edmund had no son, his heir presumptive. He had visited Blackmore Hall only rarely in the years since Edmund's wife had died, and his sudden interest in family duty was, as Mrs. Bellamy privately observed to Meg over the mending basket, about as genuine as a painted apple. He arrived with a great deal of luggage for a short visit, and an even greater deal of opinions about how the estate ought to be managed, opinions he offered freely at every meal whether they were wanted or not. Percival was a man who measured every situation by what it might cost or gain him, and it did not take him long, over the course of a single dinner, to understand exactly what was developing between his cousin and the governess, seated quietly at the far end of the table. He watched the way Edmund's eyes returned again and again to her end of the table, the way Sophie leaned naturally into her side, and he understood at once that here was something that might, left unchecked, threaten the inheritance he had quietly begun to consider his own. He said nothing directly that first evening, but his manner toward Meg was cool and faintly condescending, the kind of politeness that manages to insult without ever raising its voice. Over the following days, he found small opportunities to remind the household staff, in passing comments meant to be overheard, that a governess was a governess, and ought to remember her place. He hinted to the housekeeper that perhaps Miss Whitfield had grown rather too comfortable in a household where she held no true position, and on the third evening of his visit, he asked Edmund directly, once the two of them were alone with their brandy, whether his cousin had given any thought to what people would say if he attached himself to a penniless clergyman's daughter with no name, no fortune, and no connections worth mentioning. "She has done more for this house and for Sophie than anyone has managed in 2 years," Edmund said, more sharply than he intended. "No one doubts her usefulness," Percival replied smoothly. "But usefulness is not the same as suitability. Think of Sophie, Edmund, if not of yourself. A stepmother of uncertain birth follows a child for the whole of her life. The whispers will outlast any affection you feel now." Edmund said nothing further that night, but the words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples did not fade. He had not, in truth, examined his own feelings closely enough to know what he intended toward Meg, only that her presence had become essential to him in ways he had not stopped to question. Percival's warning forced the question into the open, and rather than answer it, Edmund did what many people do when faced with a truth they are not ready for. He retreated. Over the following days, he grew distant. He stopped seeking Meg out for conversations that had no real purpose. He answered her questions about the household with brief, formal replies, and avoided sitting with her and Sophie of an evening, as he had grown accustomed to doing. Meg noticed the change immediately, though she could not know its cause, and she drew the only conclusion available to her, that she had overstepped, that her presence had become an embarrassment to a man so far above her in rank, and that the kindness which had once extended her a fortnight's shelter had quietly run its course. She did not weep or plead. She had too much pride for that, and too much practical sense besides. Instead, she wrote, with Mrs. Bellamy's quiet help, to a family in the next county who had once mentioned needing a governess for their 3 daughters. The reply came within the week, offering her the position. Meg began, carefully and without announcement, to pack her trunk. She told no one but Mrs. Bellamy, who tried, gently, to persuade her to wait, to speak with the Duke, before deciding anything final. Meg refused. She did not wish to be the cause of difficulty in a household that had already given her more than she had any right to expect. It was Sophie who discovered the trunk, half packed in the corner of Meg's small room, on an afternoon when she had gone looking for her governess, and found instead the unmistakable evidence of departure. The child said nothing to Meg, but ran instead to find her father, something she had rarely done in 2 years, and burst into his study in tears, demanding to know if it was true that Meg was leaving, and begging him, in the halting, urgent words of a frightened child, not to let it happen. Edmund had faced a great many difficult matters since his wife's death, debts and dishonest stewards, and the slow grinding weight of grief. But nothing had struck him quite so plainly as the sight of his daughter, who had been silent for so long, sobbing openly at the thought of losing the one person who had brought her back to life. He understood, in that moment, exactly what he had been avoiding. Meg had not simply mended his household accounts or coaxed his daughter into speech. She had mended something in the family itself, something he had thought broken beyond repair. And his hesitation these past days had been nothing more than pride dressed up as caution. He went to find her at once, before she could carry her trunk any further toward the door. He found her in the small room, folding the last of her things with steady, careful hands that did not quite match the tightness in her face. He told her, without preamble, what Percival had said, and admitted plainly that the warning had frightened him into a silence he now deeply regretted. He told her that the household had not merely improved since her arrival, but had come back to life, that his daughter laughed again because of her, and that he himself had come to depend on her honesty and her company in ways far beyond what any governess's duties required. "I am not offering you a fortnight any longer," he said. "I am asking you to stay for good. Not as a tutor, and not as a guest taken in out of charity, but as my wife, if you will have me." Meg, who had spent every day since her arrival believing herself useful at best and tolerated at worst, had never once allowed herself to imagine being wanted in this way, on equal footing, with nothing owed and nothing demanded in return. She set down the folded linen in her hands and, for the first time since her father's death, allowed herself to believe that good fortune might be hers after all. She said yes. The wedding took place at Blackmore Hall itself, before the year was out, modest in size but warm in every particular. Nothing like the grand society affairs Percival had once predicted with such scorn. Mrs. Bellamy oversaw every detail of the preparations with the fierce pride of a woman watching something she had helped to build come into full bloom. Sophie walked ahead of the small wedding party carrying flowers, smiling without any effort at all, a sight that brought more than one of the older servants quietly to tears. Percival did not attend, sending only a brief and cold note of acknowledgement, but no one at Blackmore Hall found themselves troubled by his absence. The house that had stood cold and half forgotten for 2 long years was, by the time the candles were lit that evening, full of warmth, laughter, and light once more. Meg, who had arrived in the rain with nothing but a single trunk and a quiet request for work, was no longer a guest sheltered out of temporary kindness. She had become, in every way that mattered, the settled and enduring heart of the home she had once feared she might be asked to leave.